Hello, welcome to this Britlit 10 video podcast on early modern poetry. Today, Lesson 2, introducing John Milton's Paradise Lost. Before we begin, I ask that you give the material the time and the attention that it deserves. Remember, I reserve the right to give you a pop quiz on any homework assignment, including this video podcast. You may also be held responsible for this material on high-value assessments, such as projects, essays, and exams. Please resist the temptation to multitask and close all other programs on your computer, except those that you might use for note-taking. For homework, take notes as you watch and listen, stopping the video when reviewing it is necessary. Be prepared to apply what you've learned to your reading of the poem. Let's begin. Paradise Lost is an epic poem. An epic poem is a long-form narrative poem in which the protagonist performs a series of heroic deeds, travels from place to place, meeting a diversity of people, creatures, and things. The plot in an epic poem typically revolves around the theme of warfare, although that's not always true. Notable epic poems with which you might be familiar include Beowulf, the Iliad and the Odyssey, both by Homer, the Aeneid by Virgil, and the Divine Comedy by Dante. As a form of poetry, the epic is part of the oral tradition, which you learned something about when we read Beowulf. Broadly speaking, there are two types of epic poems, those that are passed along orally and then written down, and those that imitate oral poetry but in fact are written down from the start. The first group, those whose origins are oral, are known as primary epics. These include the Iliad, the Odyssey, and Beowulf. Those whose origins are written are known as secondary epics. These include the Aeneid, the Divine Comedy, and Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost is, by any standards, an extremely long poem, clocking in at about 10,000 lines, divided into 12 books. In contrast, the entire Beowulf poem, including the parts that we didn't read, comes in at just under 3,200 lines. By this measure, Paradise Lost is about 3 times as long as Beowulf. Paradise Lost is written in a meter known as blank verse, unrhymed iambic pentameter. This is a meter that was popularized in drama by Christopher Marlowe, the guy that wrote the poem The Passionate Shepherd to His Love. Shakespeare then stole the meter from Marlowe, and, perhaps as an homage to the two great dramatists of the previous century, Milton borrowed it from them. For most of his writing life, Milton had been planning to compose an epic poem in the style of his literary heroes, Homer, Virgil, and Dante. At first he thought his poem would be a chivalric romance, based on the stories of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Eventually he abandoned that idea, instead choosing the Christian Bible as his source material. It took Milton over 6 years to write Paradise Lost, and by the time that he began, he was totally blind. While writing a poem of this size is an impressive feat by any measure, it is utterly astonishing once you see how deeply elusive the poem is, how many references it makes to other works of art and other materials outside the world of the poem. Milton, who is perhaps the most well-educated and well-read writer in all of English literary history, recited the poem from memory to his daughters and other secretaries that he hired to write it all down. So let's take a look at some of the important things that you need to know in order to read Paradise Lost effectively. The first of these is a literary term, diegesis. Diegesis is the universe of the story as it is narrated, the time, the space, the characters, and the events. The diegesis of Beowulf, for example, was 5th century Scandinavia, and it includes not only Beowulf but all the rest of the characters and the things that they own and the places that they inhabit. The diegesis of Macbeth is 11th century Scotland, and it involves Macbeth's rise to and fall from power. It also includes all of the characters, Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, Duncan, Malcolm, Donald Bane, all of the Thanes, the murderers, and of course, the witches. And speaking of the supernatural, the diegesis of the Harry Potter series includes everything that belongs to that fictional universe, London, Hogwarts, and the many characters that Harry must deal with as he grows from a child into an adult and from an apprentice into a full-fledged wizard. It is important to recognize that you are reading a very small excerpt from a very large work, but you will read that small excerpt with greater understanding and deeper appreciation if we were to sketch out in rough form the diegesis of the poem as a whole. John Milton was a deeply religious man. He was strongly influenced by the views of John Calvin. In this sense, it is perhaps most helpful to think of Paradise Lost as a highly crafted form of fan fiction that takes for its material two intertwined stories from the Judeo-Christian creation narrative. The first of these is the fall of man. This thread of the story includes the creation of the earth, the creation of Adam, and then, at Adam's request, the creation of Eve, Eve's temptation by Satan, and Adam and Eve's subsequent exile from the Garden of Eden. The other major narrative thread concerns the fall of Lucifer. This includes Lucifer's rebellion against God, his and the rebel angels' exile from the kingdom of heaven, his establishment of the dominion of hell, and his subsequent temptation of Eve. Of all of this, we are only going to read the section in which Lucifer and the rebel angels are cast out of heaven and establish hell. Of all the characters in Paradise Lost, Lucifer is perhaps the most detailed, the most complex, and undergoes the greatest degree of change. In fact, over the centuries, many scholars have argued that Lucifer is the actual hero of Paradise Lost. Lucifer begins the narrative as God's most trusted angel. His name is translated in numerous ways, but the most frequent of these is bringer of light. Lucifer is second in heaven only to God and God's Son, who will later become the biblical figure Jesus. In a fit of jealousy, Lucifer persuades an innumerable legion of angels to side with him in a rebellion against God. It is Lucifer's hope to overthrow God and the Son and to rule heaven for himself. A 3-day-long battle ensues. At least it would be 3 days by man's measure, although neither man nor the earth have been created yet. The battle finds God's angels, known as the Holy Host, defending heaven against Lucifer's rebel angels. Eventually, the rebels are defeated and cast out of the kingdom of heaven. There are so many rebel angels that they continuously fall out of the sky for 9 days. They are cast into a vast wasteland, finally landing in a lake of fire. The force of God's ejection is so strong that the impact into the lake knocks them out cold. Eventually, Lucifer, now called Satan, and his army come to consciousness, reckon with their situation, and build a vast palace from which they will continually wage further war against God. There is no single moment in the text where we see Lucifer take on the name of Satan. Milton refers to him as Lucifer during those scenes that take place in heaven, and as Satan in the place that will become hell. The name Satan, however, means deceiver or adversary, and the name of his palace, which the rebel angels build upon his command in less than an hour, is called Pandemonium, or all demons. In his heart, Satan knows that he can never defeat God, but he puts up a good front, and he persuades the rebel angels that the war can be won if only they undo all of the good things that God does every time that he does them. Speaking to the rebel angels from inside their new home, Satan recalls the time that he heard God speaking about his plan to make another creature as perfect as the angels themselves, man. He begins to plot how he can corrupt this new perfect creature and so gain his revenge against God. In the world that God has created shortly after the war against the rebel angels, Adam and his mate Eve are immortal, impervious to pain, and without want. They live in the Garden of Eden, where they hold dominion over the land and the animals that inhabit it. Satan takes on a variety of disguises as he travels to this new world that God has created to do some spying. Once he's gathered enough intelligence, he disguises himself as a serpent, and he visits Eve while she's alone in the garden. Satan persuades her to violate the one and only rule that God has imposed upon her and Adam, that they do not eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Having broken that one rule, Adam and Eve are stripped of their immortality and condemned to a life of pain and suffering. In addition, they will be banished from the Garden of Eden. Before they leave the garden, the archangel Michael shows Adam what will happen as a result of his sin. Adam sees grim visions of future suffering and death, including Cain's killing of Abel, the flood that destroys most of mankind, and the exodus of the Jews from Egypt. Adam is utterly horrified by these visions, and he demonstrates true remorse for what he's done. Finally, Michael tells Adam that God's Son has vowed to go to earth in a human form and sacrifice himself for Adam and Eve's sin, thereby offering mankind a chance to return to a state of grace. With that, Adam and Eve leave Eden forever. So that's the Diegesis in a very simplified form. This brings us to the next term that you need to know, en media res. In the story that I just told you, the narrative began at the chronological beginning and it moved forward to the chronological end. My account of Paradise Lost, told to you for the purposes of helping you to understand it, unfolds in a chronological fashion. I told you the first thing that happened, then I told you the second thing that happened, and I told you the third thing that happened, and the fourth thing that happened, all the way on down the line to the end. Storytelling of this type employs a linear narrative. In linear narratives, the story moves from the beginning to the end, telling the events in the order of their occurrence. In an actual epic poem, in Paradise Lost itself, the story unfolds in a very different way. The narrative begins en media res, Latin for in the middle of things. From the middle, the narrator might jump backwards to something that happened between the first event and the middle of the story. Such backwards narrative movement is called an analepsis. It's essentially a flash backwards, and it can happen at any point in the story. From there, the narrator could flash backwards again, or he could jump forward. A forward jump is called a prolepsis. In an epic poem, the narrative is a series of prolepses and analepses that continue until the entire story is told. Another important convention of epic poetry is the invocation of the muse. In classical mythology, the Muses were the goddess daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne, and they were the embodiment of knowledge in a number of fields, including science, mathematics, drama, philosophy, and poetry. In epic poetry, the poem begins with the poets invoking or calling upon the muse to assist in the telling of the story. Oftentimes, the invocation will ask the muse to speak directly through the poet. Among the things that the poet asks for in the invocation are the inspiration, the knowledge, the skill, and the endurance necessary to tell an epic tale. So now that we have a basic understanding of the conventions at work in Paradise Lost, let's take a look at why Milton might have wanted to write such a poem in the first place. As I noted a few minutes ago, Milton was a deeply religious man. In his belief, Milton held that God was eternal, that he has been and always will be. He thought that God was omnipotent or all-powerful, that God was omniscient or all-seeing, and that God was providential, that he has mankind's best interest in mind at all times and regularly intervenes on mankind's behalf. Now on paper, this sounds great. But one need only look around to see that the world is a place of immense suffering and pain. It's both fair and reasonable to ask, if God is eternal, omnipotent, omniscient, and providential, then why is there suffering and pain in the world? Why does evil exist? Among philosophers and religious thinkers, this is the question of theodicy. It asks, if God is eternal, omnipotent, omniscient, and providential, why do pain, suffering, and evil exist in the world? It is a question that has for centuries vexed the minds of some of the world's greatest thinkers, and it is a question that Milton attempts to answer in Paradise Lost. Finally, there is one more term that you need to know, and, like the Odyssey, this one comes to us from the world of philosophy. The dialectic is a mechanism for thinking through certain philosophical questions or problems. In this mechanism, two opposing forces come together in conflict, eventually to be resolved in the production of some sort of truth or greater understanding. The first element in the dialectic is called the thesis. It could be an abstract idea, or a proposition, or even something concrete. The opposing force is called the antithesis. These two forces clash, and the result is called the synthesis. We will look at this mechanism in some detail during class, but for now you should know the three parts and how they interact. Milton saw good and evil as opposing forces, as thesis and antithesis. And for Milton, goodness was meaningless unless it was engaged in an ongoing struggle with evil. In Paradise Lost, God purposely lets Satan establish himself first in hell and then on earth so that human beings would have something to fight against and, with God's help, defeat. When Adam and Eve lose paradise, they also gain something, the opportunity to prove themselves in ways not possible in Eden. The Archangel Michael, when he comes to escort Adam and Eve out of the perfect garden where they lived so happily, tells them how to live in their new, imperfect world. Exercise faith and virtue and patience and temperance and love and charity. Then thou wilt not be loath to leave this paradise, but shall possess a paradise within thee, happier far. That concludes this Britlit 10 video podcast on John Milton's Paradise Lost. We will begin reading the poem in our next class. See you then.